Welcome, welcome, fifth graders, to our second core lesson of our ninth week together. We are here ready to start our lesson. Be sure to have the Google Classroom note taker for this lesson handy. If you were not able to take a look at Google Classroom before the lesson, go ahead and take a moment to pull up the most recent note taker that I posted. Now, this note taker is actually quite cool. It is a slideshow. I really love this because in the slideshow there are different tools such as a timeline. So today, whether or not you are feeling comfortable to take notes directly in that note taker or just to take notes by hand, those are things that you are going to need to be doing at this time. Now, I do have a exciting video that I am going to share with this for today. But before we get started, let's take a look, not at that yet. Here we go. Here we go. Okay. Let's take a look at our teaching point for today. Say it with me now. Who has had the right to vote throughout the history of our country? And our second teaching point is, who determines who is allowed to vote? Now, these are really important questions that just as citizens we have to ask ourselves. But not just that, these questions are going to guide us as we take a more macro approach to voting history throughout America. Now, fifth grade is an awesome year for so many different reasons. Really, fifth grade, the part that I'm thinking of is really the work that we do as 10 and 11-year-old students who are future voting citizens. We need to get a deeper understanding of what voting has looked like from the beginning of the time when the United States was first constituted in 1776. Even before then, who was making all the rules? Well, we are going to be diving more deeply into the American Revolution, all the events leading up to colonizers who then removed themselves from the British. And we are going to go further in depth in that moment. We are going to also be going further in depth into the civil rights movement. All of these have really important pieces that connect them, which is the history of the United States and the history of voting in the United States. So today we're going to have a general look at how has voting changed throughout history? Who has been allowed to vote? Who has had the right to vote? When did they get the right to vote? Because we know that there are moments in our recent history that have given people the right to vote who before didn't have to. And yes, your exit ticket is a slideshow. So I'm grateful that you guys are here and ready to do some work with me. Take a look at these goals that I have written right here for you. Say it with me. My goal is to take simple notes and write down any questions I have. Now, you might have already started taking your notes by writing down our focus questions for this lesson, and these are really going to guide us. Now, if you take a look at the slideshow that I shared with you, you will notice that it is set up in such a way where I am asking you to let me know who had the right to vote at that time period. Okay? We are going to watch a video that is going to help us understand who had the right to vote during what time. So while you are getting this teaching point written down, I also want to remind you that voting is a really pivotal part in American history. Voting has not been something that people have had easy access to. And even today, there are a lot of disagreements in how we should be setting up our citizens to vote. A lot of people are worried that their vote isn't going to count. And when we have these worries or anxieties, they either are rooted in real events, real moments that have happened in history for actual examples. And some people are taking things, and some people don't have moments in history to rely on. When we talk about voter fraud, for instance, in the United States, there have been less than 0.1% of instances where people have tried to have a fraudulent vote. So when we hear these things out in the world, we often have to ask ourselves, did this happen? And are there moments in history where we can look at and point to for information so that we can feel confident in our voting system? So let's dive right in. I have a video for you. When you're watching this video, I am going to say, this video is going to give us some of the answers we're looking for. Now, in the note taker, I have 5 different things that you're taking notes on. I want you, when you're listening and watching this video, to really be present, think deeply. Who was allowed to vote? Who wasn't allowed to vote? What amendment gave a certain group of people the right to vote? And did that amendment still allow those citizens to vote? So without further waiting, let's get started.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Pursuit of History. On this episode, we'll be discussing the history of voting rights. Casting a vote for local, state, and federal officials is an important civic responsibility in America. It's an opportunity to have your voice be heard and to engage with members of your community in the democratic process. For American citizens, the chance to vote begins at 18, but that wasn't always the case. In the early years of America, only a small percentage of people were allowed to vote. Keep going. Keep going, almost there. Okay, stop. At the founding of America, only adult, white, landowning men were allowed to vote. Not surprisingly, the people making the decisions in the early days of America were, you guessed it, white male landowners. While they wanted to ensure that the power of government came from the people, they struggled with determining exactly who qualified as the people. As James Madison said, allow the right to vote exclusively to property owners, and the rights of persons may be oppressed. Extend it equally to all, and the rights of property owners may be overruled by a majority without property. It was quite the early conundrum. They ultimately decided to leave the decision up to individual states. Some states dropped the property requirement over time, but the pool of voters was still limited to adult white men until 1870, with the passing of the 15th Amendment. 5 years after the Civil War ended, the 15th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. With it, African American men gained the right to vote. On March 31, 1870, a man named Thomas Mundy Peterson became the first black person to cast a vote in a local election in New Jersey. Unfortunately, states still found ways to limit African American men's right to vote through literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation tactics, and grandfather clauses. Grandfather clauses stated that African American men could only vote if their grandfather had voted. This limited the vote for many men who had enslaved ancestors. The clauses weren't declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court until 1915. Likewise, poll taxes and literacy tests in the South became voting barriers. In Mississippi, for example, voters were required to pay a special tax for 2 years before being allowed to cast a vote. If you couldn't afford to pay the poll tax, you couldn't vote. States also issued literacy tests filled with complicated questions designed to severely limit the African American vote. The 1900s brought a wave of changes. In 1920, a new group of American citizens gained the right to vote. women. The ratification of the 19th Amendment was a great victory for the supporters of women's suffrage. 4 years later, in 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act finally gave American Indians the right to vote. Remember the poll taxes and literacy tests we talked about a few moments ago? In the 1950s and 60s, civil rights groups began making progress towards breaking down those barriers. In 1964, the 24th Amendment was passed, making poll taxes illegal. That same year, the Civil Rights Act was passed. It forbid discrimination based on religion, race, gender, or national origin. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed. It forbid anyone from denying the right to vote to citizens based on their race. Another historic event happened in 1965. President Johnson made the decision to send military forces into Vietnam. In the years that followed, support for the Vietnam War waned. Simultaneously, a new fight was emerging on the home front: the fight for the right to vote for young Americans. Armed with a call to action from the 1940s, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote" became their rallying cry. In 1970, the 26th Amendment was passed, extending the right to vote to all U.S. citizens of age 18 and over. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act became a law. It works to protect the right to vote for people with disabilities by requiring polling locations be accessible to all. In the years that have followed, Americans are still debating issues about voting rights. From the voting rights of convicted felons, to lowering the voting age to 16, and even establishing Election Day as a national holiday, people understand the importance of the right to vote and fight every single day to ensure that this right is safely secured in American democracy. Thank you so much for watching.
Okay. Wow. So, to wrap up, if you were unable to take notes just before we summarize this video that we just watched together, if you were able to watch the video and listen carefully, I think that that's phenomenal. It's likely you will need to watch that specific YouTube video more than once to really get a full picture of notes that are clear, and not just clear for you to write down, but that you clearly understand the progression of who was allowed to vote and how over time the voting history of who gets to vote has changed. Now, this question of who determines who is allowed to vote is a larger question that we likely are not going to answer today. However, I want us to consider that this fight has been happening since the late 1700s, and it is 2020. It is the year 2020 at this point in time. We are still having conversations today. As the end of the video discussed, people are considering changing the voting age to 16. People would like to have Election Day as a national holiday, because oftentimes people who have to work have to sit in extremely long lines so that their vote can count before the polls close. And not just that, if you have ever been convicted of a crime, you are no longer eligible to vote. So these are three really big things that are still happening today, that we are still having these conversations about. And really asking questions like, was it okay for our founding fathers, for example, James Madison, to say that if we allow people who are not property owners and who are not white men to vote, then that means that more people are going to be allowed to vote to share their opinion, and whoever the majority is, they're the ones who are going to make who are going to determine the outcome of the elections, right? Should it be the right of each state to say, oh, we're going to have the grandfather clock clause in our state, but some other states don't have that? right? So that is a predicament because in 1915, our Supreme Court said this was actually unconstitutional. So then I'm wondering, what questions you might have as far as what if we did this differently? Or because this happened, how has this influenced our country's history, especially our country's history as it relates to voting rights? So these are all questions that are coming up for me. So I can only imagine how many questions you might have. Now, in the note taker, I do want to say I only gave space for you to take notes up to 1924. Please take time to fill out that. And I will be adding a separate section where we can take notes on a timeline from what happened after 1924 to present day. So, just to be clear, at this point in time, you are answering that very first focus question by completing the exit ticket. It is likely you will need to rewatch not this entire video, but the 5-minute video on YouTube that I have also linked in Google Classroom with the exit ticket slideshow. So I hope that that was clear. We are going to wrap up because I am a few minutes behind for our small group for writing. I will see you guys shortly, and take care, my future voters.